I'll strip away your flesh to make the journey easier, but still you'll feel pain, hunger, weariness, thirst, and despair. They're all part of stories, the part not often told. And death, yes, but don't worry. As long as your task remains, you come back. Go on your way, Seeker. Maybe we'll meet again, or maybe not. Either way, it'll be an experience for you. I'm jealous in some ways. I hope you find what you're looking for.
The end of December is rolling in, Christmas is right around the corner, which means it's a perfect time for a game about stories. No, not that one. This game showed up on a list of games from the Humble Choice this December, and I'm a little surprised I didn't notice it sooner. Well, better late than never, I suppose. Apparently this game didn't exactly sell well back in 2018, which I find to be rather unfortunate given my experience with it. But we'll get into that later. Pack your things and get your hitchhiker's thumb ready, because we're going on a long journey. This is where the water tastes like wine.
Hey there, stranger. You're welcome to enjoy this fire with me, if you're respectful, that is. This here is my spot, and I ain't inclined to share it with any bad characters. You can call me Quinn. These here are my venturing companions. Kaz is the big un, and the one with the spots is Flip. I usually beat my way on the rails, but the road news said this town was fat, and the weather was fine. So I'm taking in the sights and seeing what I can drum up. I want to hear one of them venturing tales. Got any?
Where the Water Tastes Like Wine is another heavily stylized game, which, if you couldn't guess from my previous reviews, I'm generally in favor of. I'll probably make a video detailing more about my feelings on graphics versus style at some point, but to sum it up here, the stylized art of this game makes it feel much more distinct and unique than something trying to go for realism. The art is this heavily cel-shaded, hand-drawn style that makes all the illustrations look like the drawings in a book like Huckleberry Finn. Distinct enough that you can make out people and objects, but abstract enough that you still have to imagine some of it using the context of what you're reading. Granted, most of the text in the game is either a spoken character or is narrated to you by Keith Farley, whom some of you might know as Thane from Mass Effect. Yeah, the narration is wonderful, and it also brings me over to the sound and music, which I believe to be the standout of this game. Not only is Farley's narration amazingly crisp, but the music is some of the best modern Americana I've ever heard. It's got a perfect mix of jazz, country, blues, etc. that all shift into each other based on what area of the country you're in. Even the same song will change its tune based on whether you're in the Mid-Atlantic, Deep South, or Midwest. It's amazing, and it's something you can show if you ever come across those people who say America doesn't have any culture. Speaking of culture though, the story.
I'll save that one for a sermon sometime. Freedom? I have it now. I hear it a lot. You give the best sermons I ever heard, Brother Jimmy. Why don't you become a pastor and start your own church? Well, I like the freedom. Jesus didn't preach to the Canaanites alone after all. So no church or temple or praise house for me. My congregation is America itself. Anyway, why don't you tell me a scary story? You must have heard some good ones.
After losing a dubious at best card game to a mysterious suited wolf man, you're cursed by him, stripped down to your bones, and told to go travel the land that is Depression-era America, gathering stories from all around and spreading them, making them grow into bigger and more fantastical tales that weave themselves into the tapestry of the greater American story itself, all to find the deepest and truest stories that the land has to offer. Now, that's the way the game phrases it. If we want to be really blunt about this, the game is really just a walking simulator where you just go around and listen to occasional snippets of the story here and there. On top of that, some things do feel a little out of place in the overall world. The game takes place in Depression-era America, which goes from roughly the very late 20s into most of the 30s. Yet some of the stories feel more Western and frontier-ish than that. Something from the late 1800s rather than the early to mid 1900s. I get that the dev wanted to get some sort of message across like with Franklin's story, but his feels more like a story from the Reconstruction era, something that was long over by the 1930s. Some of these stories also get egregiously out of time, like the Headless Horseman, whose story dates way back to the 1800s, or Johnny Appleseed, whom you meet in the 1930s as John Chapman, when in reality, John Chapman was born in 1774, meaning that these two stories should have already long been told and spread before the time of the game. And this also includes Casey Jones, who died in 1900, yet you're meeting him sometime in the 30s in Florida. And on a side note, the developer clearly has a certain worldview that they seem at least a little up their own rear about, calling it a brand new genre and experimental when it's ultimately just a walking sim. The pretentiousness coming off of some of their writing possibly explaining why the continuity of America's Tales seems to be ignored at times. But the execution of that walking sim stuff is definitely more engaging than something like Dear Esther.
His smile lights up the room, or rather the cab of the locomotive. Folks gather round as he holds the pull cord. He's a showman through and through.
You'll want to cover your ears now for this next part.
Sure doesn't help much. Engineer pulls that chain and the whistle blasts inside your skull. He just smiles through it all. Man must be half deaf. A round of applause erupts from the small crowd. He passes out bubble gum to the shell-shocked kids, half of them in awe, half in tears.
Remember now who gets you there on the advertised. Casey Jones.
Everyone's all talk as they head back to their seats. That engineer sure is handsome. Gosh, and that whistle sounded just like a whippoorwill, didn't it? Ain't this the way to travel?
As I said before, the game is a walking simulator. The primary thing you do is walk around a stylized version of the American landscape, picking up little stories here and there to spread around. But there are some more things to it than just that. But first off, I want to address something about the game that's been annoying me since the start, and it's this stuttering. I don't know what's going on or if it shows in the recorded footage, but the game is constantly stuttering a bunch when I'm just trying to walk around. I don't know if the game is trying to render environments or load new things all the time, but it's definitely noticeable when you play, since it makes the otherwise calm experience of traveling around very jittery and immersion breaking. On top of that, and I know the developer acknowledged this, the game does not do very well on mouse and keyboard. Despite being a primarily PC game, the devs apparently only place-tested it using controller, which meant that the main way people play games on PC got kneecapped during development. And the game really doesn't like it if you try to swap between the two. I've had times where I try swapping the game controls, and the game just stops taking inputs altogether, forcing me to close it manually and restart. Definitely not the best from a technical point of view. Now, the key thing you're doing in between all your train hopping, hitchhiking, and trying not to die is telling stories to various characters by a campfire, with the end goal being to discover their true stories beneath all the layers of who they are. They'll ask for a certain kind of story, and you search through all the ones you've gathered and tell them the ones they want to satisfy them until you've unlocked the next chapter of their story, which, again, may or may not be more out of time than others. The system itself is neat, but I found a few odd things here and there. For one, the context of the story seems to have no impact on whether the character likes it or not. For instance, if anyone asks for a hopeful story, it doesn't matter who they are, they'll always love the story of the Italian socialist in New York. It doesn't matter at all if that person is inclined to approve of socialism or Gramsci who gets name-dropped in that story, or anything like that. They'll just like it as though it's a generic immigrant tale, even though the big mass migration period where most of those stories came from was around the mid-1800s. On top of that, some stories you can't really tell fit a certain mood until after they've changed. Like when someone wanted a happy story, I figured I'd tell them the story of the man saving a near-extinct species of pigeons. But apparently that story is actually not happy because later it's supposed to evolve into the story of the killer pigeons, despite me not having that part at the time. So there were definitely a lot of places to improve, from stability to fixing the time period, consistency, to making the context of the stories have more impact. And lastly, the game seems to have a problem of lacking a lot of happy stories. Like, I get that it's Depression-era America, but there was still hope, happiness, and goodness even back then for average citizens.
He sings as he works, his voice warm and soft as the late afternoon sun. The air's sweet with the tang of recently cut sugar cane. There's a practiced, almost soothing precision to the way he works. He looks up and nods hello. "Making molasses," he says to your unasked question. "I sell the blackstripe in town. Farmers use it for feed. Bitter as hell." He grins. "Got some set aside." He comes back with a murky flask, waving off any offer of payment. "I ain't charging. Folks around here need what they can get. Makes a mean loaf of bread." He nods at the barrels. "I'm about done filtering. Got to boil it next. Lend a hand?" You help him haul the barrels over to the metal boiler. You pour in the juice and set the fire. It's hot work. He fetches water and dark bread, and you share the small meal and a smile. It's good to find another who takes joy in honest labor.
And that is where the water tastes like wine. Overall, it's definitely an interesting game, and one that I still enjoy a good bit despite its issues. I think the main problems with the game come from what feels like the developer getting technical and narrative tunnel vision, trying to make a point about things like Manifest Destiny to the point where the setting starts to become inconsistent or contradictory. And the gameplay similarly falters from a lack of playtesting and a failure to recognize that people play games in other ways than the developer. Also, supposedly the last achievement in the game is outright impossible to get unless you're the dev or their friend, which I get is supposed to call back to the title, but still, don't do that in the future. It just makes you look like an ass. Still, I think it's neat at least, and the music is top notch. This has been TheRatMan, and I will see you all later.